So welcome everyone. This is the Cannabis Research Center's spring seminar series. Today we are talking about cannabis landscapes in Southern Oregon, a story map launch event. There's also another webinar next week that I hope you'll all tune in for. Jeff, do you just want to say like a one sentence about what that webinar is going to be?
Hi, everyone. Yes, next Monday at noon, I believe, yes, at noon, we're going to be talking with a few cannabis growers about the impacts of wildfire and smoke on their operations, mitigation strategies that they've been using, and we're going to also sort of talk up our survey, which is ongoing right now, of statewide growers around wildfire and smoke impacts on cannabis production.
Thanks so much. So we hope you'll tune in for that one next week. So for today, we're really excited to present to you about this new story map that we have on the CRC website. So we'll do a couple of quick introductions. My name is Phoebe Parker-Shames. I'm a sixth-year PhD candidate at UC Berkeley in environmental science, policy, and management. And my dissertation research is on the ecological outcomes of cannabis legalization. Now, I'm actually from Southern Oregon, which is part of why I'm really passionate about this work, and in particular, bringing some of these results into a publicly accessible format with this story map.
So my name is Chris Choi. I'm a research associate with the Natural Resources Ecology Lab at Colorado State University. But previously, I was at the Oregon Department of State Lands, and my background is in GIS and remote sensing and ecological research. So it's great to partner with Phoebe and other folks to work on this project.
Today, we are here to talk about this story map that you can find at the CRC website. And I will, as part of this, show you how to locate the map on the website. So as a quick overview of what we're going to do today, we're going to talk about some of our science communication goals with this outreach tool. Chris is going to give you an overview of the research that went into this story map. I'm going to walk you through it on the website, and then we'll finish it off by talking about some of the potential uses for this or similar types of outreach tools. So environmental research on cannabis is really important because this is a booming new industry with a range of environmental concerns for its potential impacts on wildlife, land, and water. As scientists, we're given the task of informing policy with research. However, because of its illicit history, cannabis is lacking that foundation of research that we would usually use. So this is why it's so important that as we're collecting new information on cannabis, we communicate it back to the public. So research is really needed for ongoing community dialogue on land use and policy decision making. But in order for our ongoing research to actually inform this dialogue, we as researchers need to find ways to make our findings more accessible. Hence why we created this mapping tool. So our goals for this tool are to communicate the research findings that we have conducted under another publication on cannabis land use and communicate it in an interactive format. And this is really to spark community conversations starting from this baseline understanding and data. So now Chris is going to talk to you about what that data is.
So yeah, I'd love to introduce the research that went on behind the story map that Phoebe will be presenting later. So the story map we're presenting on today is based on the results of our recent study, where we tried to answer two main questions. Firstly, what was the development pattern of private land cannabis in Josephine County during Oregon's first year of legalization? And for this study, we're focusing on private land, cannabis on private land, definitely something to note. And how might cannabis production overlap with sensitive ecological features? All right. And on the slide, we see our study area, which was Josephine County in Oregon, which is in the southwest of Oregon, and it borders California as well. Although Oregon legalized production of cannabis in 2015, 2016 was the first growing season. And so that's a year that we took specific interest in. On the right, we have a map with the number of cannabis plants per watershed that were in the county in 2016 that we recorded. And this is quite an interesting region because it's a region with a lot of legacy growers. It's got quite a long history with cannabis production. And in the past, and still today, a lot of this production occurs in pretty remote areas. And on the next slide, we also see that Josephine County is part of the Klamath-Siskiyou ecoregion, which is one of the most biodiverse regions in the entire United States and contains critical microclimate refugia. So we can see that Josephine County is nestled in that northern portion of that climate microrefugia, where there's quite a lot of priority areas in those red circles. The region is also habitat for threatened and endangered species, such as fishers and coho salmon. And here we talk about some of the research approach that we took to understand the questions that we wanted to answer. So the first step of the project was, in fact, to map and describe these cannabis farms during this early phase of legalization. And then we assessed spatial relationships of these cannabis farms with areas of conservation concern, right? And we did this to understand the land cover types where we find cannabis in, determine cannabis's production overlap with carnivore occupancy, since carnivores are especially vulnerable to site level disturbances, and also the proximity of cannabis farms to some wanted habitats as well. And lastly, we compared these private land parcels with cannabis to all land parcels in Josephine County to understand what may be the broader scale impacts of cannabis production. So I'm sure you're wondering, how did we map these farms? So on the next slide, we see an image from Google Earth, which displays publicly available satellite imagery. I'm sure a lot of folks have been on and zoomed around to find their house. But we can also see farms here quite visibly shown and identifiable. And so you can see in those green polygons, we've outlined some of these cannabis production sites. And so this is a photo from 2013. I remember 2015 was the first year of legalization. So this represents a pre-legalization landscape. And then this is that same landscape 3 years down the line in the first growing season after recreational cannabis legalization. And this is the year that we use to quantify production. And so what we did is, we identified where these farms were, drew polygons around them. And then we mapped them outdoor grows and also greenhouse production, and recorded different kinds of variables. Firstly, we gave each feature a confidence score for how confident we were that this truly was cannabis. We counted the plants and whether the site was new or not based on comparisons with that pre-legalization imagery. And for these outdoor grows, you can see it's quite easy to count individual plants, see them dotted on the landscape. But for greenhouses, we estimated plants based on an area per plant calculation from 180 instances, where we could actually see through the greenhouse well enough to count these plants. And after we documented these plants, we used these maps to assess spatial relationships to measurements of conservation concern. And on the next slide, we see how we did that as well. So we extracted where each farm was. We extracted what the land cover was based on the National Land Cover Database from 2013. And we chose to do 2013 rather than a later date to reduce the likelihood that the cannabis itself being new on the landscape could be influencing the cover classification. We used the same approach to extract the slope at each farm using a 10-meter digital elevation model, and also the projected predator occupancy from an OSU, Oregon State University database. Then we also assessed the nearest distance to fresh water from the center of each farm as well as the distance to high potential coho salmon habitat. And lastly, we also compared these cannabis parcels that were on private land to other parcels of private land across the county. And so what did we find? We found that results were similar regardless of whether we included low confidence sites or not. But we erred on the side of caution, and we stuck with only analyzing high confidence sites. We found that the number of farms did increase dramatically after legalization, so from 2013 to 2016. And what we saw is that 67% of farms in 2016 were not observable in 2013. Although it's a large increase, we know that there's actually still a relatively small scale of production. In total, cannabis farming only occupies 331 acres across the entire county. But of where the small scale production occurs, we do observe significant clustering of these farms. So in this Geddes or GI star analysis, we identified hotspots of production, which you can see in the figure. The left map of the figure shows hotspots at the county level, and the right map shows hotspots at the watershed level. And these were both definitely levels, spatial levels that we were quite interested in understanding, but using a Ripley's K-test, we actually found clustering. We found that clustering occurs at every spatial level in the county. And lastly, we found that cannabis is pretty common across all private parcels at 6%. We then compared, so we understood where some of these hotspots were, perhaps areas of concern. We then compared these hotspots to some other species. And here we have cannabis hotspots overlapping an overall species richness map in map A, and that hotspot is that red area. We see that predator species richness, the overall richness, is quite evenly distributed across the county. But looking at individual species, and you can see from B to F, we compared it to bobcat occupancy, cougars, ringtails, gray foxes, and fishers. We see that different species overlap or don't overlap strongly with hotspots of cannabis production. So back to the question we tried to answer in this paper: what was the development pattern of cannabis land use in Josephine County during the first year of legalization, and how might cannabis production overlap with sensitive ecological features? So interestingly, compared to all available private parcels, cannabis development patterns seem to be generally quite similar. However, there are a few more on forested parcels and slightly closer to rivers. We noticed that it's also closer to coho salmon habitat and predicted fisher habitat. In fact, overall, occupancy was 5 times greater on private land parcels with cannabis farms than non-cannabis producing private land for fishers. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Phoebe to take us through the story map.
So we then took this research that Chris just described and we translated into an interactive format. So for this, we sort of selected some of the variables that we thought translated best into this format, and then we added some new ones like zoning and proximity to protected areas that have been particularly important for conversations around the siting of cannabis in Josephine County. So from here, I'm actually going to take us on a walkthrough of the website itself. I'm going to be using my second screen, so if you see me looking over to the side, I'm actually looking at the website itself. So here we go. So if you go to the crc.berkeley.edu, our homepage for the Cannabis Research Center, you can locate the story map by clicking on the story map tab, and you can either click directly into the Josephine County one, or you can click on the tab and then into Josephine County. So this will open up the story map within our CRC website itself. So a quick note when you're using the story map in this format is that there are essentially two scroll bars on the side. We've got a scroll bar for the outside that moves you within the CRC website, and then we have an inner scroll bar that moves you through the cannabis story map itself. If you prefer to view the story map in full screen, you can go ahead and go to this about/contact section and click on our link for the full screen. We do request that when you are sharing this story map with others, that you please use the crc.berkeley address instead. First of all, it's a lot easier to remember, fewer potential typos when you're typing out the URL, but also because we can actually track the hits when it's on the CRC website, so we can sort of get a sense for how useful is this tool? Are people really engaging with it and using it? But for today, I'm going to use this full screen version for ease of sharing. So for the story map, you can just scroll through all of the sections, or you can use these tabs at the top to move to any of the locations in the story map that you want. This is helpful because I will also admit that this is a pretty bandwidth intensive format for the story map. So sometimes there may be maps that don't load correctly. When that happens, you can just refresh the page. Usually it will actually bring you right back to where you were in the story map, but if it doesn't, you can use these tabs to navigate to where you were in the story. So we start with an introduction about cannabis and sort of specifically in the Western US, some of the dialogue and questions that have come up with it. And right away, we get one of our first interactive elements. So this is the comparison slider map. So you can use this slider to move back and forth between the two images. So starting here on the left, this is an image in 2013 before recreational legalization. And then when you move it and look at the image on the right, we see an image from 2016 in the first growing season after recreational legalization. And so you can see some of these cannabis farms coming in post legalization. Then as we move on, we have sort of an overview of Josephine County. We start with this broad interactive map. This is particularly useful if you're not from Josephine County and you want to get the sense of, where are you in relation to where this county is? You can zoom in a little closer, take a look at what the large towns are, what's nearby. So you can explore this a little bit. The legend for this one is in the bottom left, but there's not really much to look at on this case. When you're ready, you can keep scrolling through. Next, we have sort of a little background about cannabis and its cultural history within the region, and sort of an overview of the legalization timeline and some of the changes that have happened with cannabis in the area. Then we go through some background on cannabis in the environment and why we might be particularly concerned about some impacts of cannabis on local environment. Then we go through some of the methods. You can read the paper that Chris was talking about for free. We have it linked at multiple points in this story map, so please feel free to check out the research directly. But we essentially lay out what Chris just went over, talking about the way that we created this data. And now we have the maps themselves. So this is sort of the heart of the story map itself. We start with getting you oriented to the map. So because we used private land, our analyses are limited to the scope that you see illustrated in this map. We also summarized everything to the 5 kilometer squared hexagon. So this is essentially showing you the total extent of the data we're using in these analyses. Next, we have the map of cannabis itself and its sort of concentrations based on numbers of cannabis. So you'll see, for instance, the hexes that have no cannabis are grayed out. So those are private lands that had no detectable cannabis within the hex. Or I should say, no high confidence detected cannabis in that hex. You can zoom in and out on this map. You can click on individual hexes to get the total number of cannabis plants. You can open and close the legend in the bottom left corner, and you can also make this map full screen if you wish. We've got a few sort of summaries on the left here as you scroll. We've done, for instance, a very rough estimate of sort of the economic input from cannabis in 2016. These are based on OLCC's retail price numbers. Obviously, this is an incredibly rough estimate. If any of you know economists who want to do a deeper dive, work on these numbers, be really happy to share data. And then from the cannabis, we go into zoning. So this first map is just to get you oriented to what is zoning, what does it look like? So this is illustrating parcels, and they are color coded based on zoning descriptions. You can actually click on each one, get a read the zoning code description, acreage, and sort of a description of what that zone is supposed to be used for. And this will help us understand the next map, which is our county-wide zoning summary. So now the hexes are colored based on the predominant zoning for cannabis in that cell. So it's saying of all the cannabis farms that are in parcels in each of those cells, which zoning category has the most cannabis, or which zoning category is cannabis most often in. So you can click on individual hexes to get a breakdown in more detail of number of cannabis plants, the available parcels of private land, and then the available and then the used parcels for cannabis. And if you scroll down further, you actually get a pie chart that shows you the breakdown. So most parcels of cannabis are in residential zones in this particular hex. There's also some on farm zones and forest zones. And then we compare it to what is available. So most private parcels in this hex are residential, but we also have some farm zones and some industrial commercial. So on a hex level, you can actually do some comparisons and say, okay, so there's a lot of residential available, but what's actually used is a little bit less of the residential and a little bit more of forest and farm for cannabis. If you scroll down even further, you'll actually get sort of our groupings of the zones. So it was a little hectic to include all zone classes, because as you saw from the previous image, there's something like 40, maybe more individual zoning classes. So we grouped them into farm, forest, residential, industrial, and commercial, and other. And you can read more about those groupings on a link that we've included in this sidebar. So then we get to protected areas. We've grouped protected areas in 3 different ways, and I will let you explore them on your own a little bit. So the first one is all protected areas in Josephine County. You can explore what those are in this map here. So for instance, you can actually click on these individual areas and they will tell you what they are, what their names are. Now we have a comparison map. So starting here on the left, we have the distribution of private land parcels in relation to all protected areas. So if you open up here on the bottom left, you can get the legend. So these are color coded. So the brighter red means that they are closer to protected areas. So this is for all private land parcels. We see that there's a lot of, since there's a lot of protected areas, there's a lot of proximity of private land to protected areas. And then we move the slider over to cannabis. You can scroll down here and see the legend. The distance categories are the same. This one now also includes gray for cells that did not contain cannabis. So you can see here that in general, if a cell is predominantly close to protected areas for private land generally, it will probably predominantly be used by cannabis in areas that are close to protected areas. So in that way, it's very similar to the private lands. However, you actually see that of those available, there is fewer of the bright red that is actually being used by cannabis. So for this sort of classification of protected areas, we actually see that cannabis is probably proportionally less close to those protected areas. We have also broken it down by protected areas that are specifically managed for biodiversity. So these would be ones, excluding things like BLM, but more sort of ones that are focused on conservation and biodiversity. So we have a similar map here, where on the left, we look at the distribution of all private land and then the distribution of cannabis. I'm not going to go into as much depth on this. And then we also break it down by all government-owned protected areas. So this excludes small private protected areas, for example. Next, we have salmonid habitat. So we are specifically looking at coho because based on our analyses from the initial paper, coho were the species that we had most concerns about its proximity to cannabis. So here you can actually look at that distribution. So for all private land parcels, the darker red means that it's closer to coho salmon habitat. We see that overall across the entire county, much of the private land is located fairly close to coho salmon habitat. And then when we compare it to cannabis, we see that much of those regions that are close to coho salmon habitat are also close to coho salmon habitat for cannabis. And that specifically a lot of those areas are still being used by cannabis. So this creates some amount of concern for proximity. Now we have freshwater. So on the left here, we see that the darker blue means most parcels are less than 10 meters away from freshwater source. As you can see from this map, the vast majority of private land in the county is very close to freshwater. There's a lot of rivers and streams and ponds and lakes in this county. Interestingly, when you look at cannabis, despite there being ongoing a lot of concerns about cannabis and freshwater use and impacts, compared to private land as a whole, actually a lot of those parcels that are really close to freshwater aren't being used predominantly for cannabis. So that's sort of a surprising result to me, at least. I thought that was very interesting. Now, finally, we have a map to give us an indication of how some of these data may change over time. So some of you may have heard about Chris Hall's new Illinois Valley Soil and Water Conservation District report on cannabis in the Illinois Valley, which is located in this portion of Josephine County. Our data sets aren't directly comparable, but he did aerial flyovers in 2021 and marked where cannabis farms are. So each of these little photograph icons represents a cannabis farm. So you can actually get a sense based on the clustering how these areas in 2016 that were intensive for farming have continued to be predominant growing regions into 2021. You can also even click on individual points and look at aerial imagery of each of these farms. And then finally, we give sort of summary and conclusions, both based on these maps and also some of the additional analyses from the paper. Although we remind everyone that these maps are also here for you to make your own conclusions and look for your own patterns. And finally, we have the About and Contact page. So there is a Google form here that you can use to give us feedback about this product. If you notice any errors or issues, or you have concerns about the data, please use that contact form to let us know, get in touch. It also gives us a sense of how people are engaging with this tool. Again, we have the two different links to access it. Please use the CRC one to share widely, We have some acknowledgements for the creation of the paper, as well as for this story map product itself. So what do we want you to use these maps for? Well, first, we hope that it sparks discussions. We want you to share this with your friends, talk about it, discuss what it may mean in terms of what cannabis looks like in its recent past, where it's headed in the future, and what you want it to look like. We also hope that this inspires similar projects outside of Josephine County as a way to share and communicate cannabis research, because obviously the impacts are really wide reaching across all the West Coast or even the whole country. And this sort of county specific focus helps get into sort of specific community concerns around cannabis land use. And then perhaps most importantly, we hope it assists in thinking about possible consequences or trade-offs of outreach or education, policy or regulation, and enforcement efforts. So specifically, I have some examples of questions that people can contemplate as a result of these maps. So think about, where should cannabis ideally be located? What do you want cannabis landscapes to look like in 10 years? Are there, for instance, trade-offs in those locations between things like available zoning or proximity to coho salmon habitat? So say you really feel like cannabis should be grown on farming zone parcels. Where are those farming zone parcels located in relation to things like cell-modded habitat or freshwater? One thing that really hits home for me looking at these maps is how pervasive cannabis is in Josephine County. Our study found that in 2016, 6% of private land parcels had cannabis of more than 4 plants, high confidence. That represents thousands of landowners in what is already a rural county. Many of those farms were likely not legal. So to me, this raises the issue that what if equitable enforcement of cannabis laws and regulations across the county is infeasible? So given that, how should we be prioritizing enforcement? Or do we even have the data that we need to make those prioritization decisions? For example, if you would like to see enforcement prioritize environmental impact, what available, reliable, and equitable metrics do we have at a broad scale? Or if we decide enforcement isn't the only tool that we should be using, then have we explored some of those alternatives? So for example, I am hopeful that we could use these maps to start identifying areas that might be useful for targeted outreach and education around best management practices for cannabis cultivation. So maybe using these areas where like, oh, we see in these regions, there's a lot of cannabis farmers all growing in one area. Maybe that gives us an opportunity to help engage in those networks that are already talking about growing practices and implement some more sustainability solutions. This is really all just to say that these maps are only the beginning of a conversation, and it's one that I hope you will all engage in. So with that, I want to say thank you and give some acknowledgements. So this story map was created in consultation with Aaron Howard and Jamie Trammell, along with Chris and myself. I also want to give a big thank you to the original paper co-authors, Van Butzik, David Green, Brent Berry, Katie Moriarty, Tal Levy, and Justin Brashear, as well as Chris and myself, and our undergraduate assistants who did a huge amount of work mapping these cannabis farms individually, as well as to the Cannabis Research Center at large. You can find Chris and my email addresses up here, and you're also welcome to follow me on Twitter. Please reach out if you have any questions. So we have a question here from Van that says, can you discuss your thought process and how detailed to share information that some may consider private, growing cannabis on private property? What are the trade-offs between providing useful information versus maintaining privacy? This is a question that I've thought about a lot, and is part of the reason why I specifically used Google Earth imagery for the mapping process, because I felt uncomfortable buying satellite imagery that not everyone would have access for to map something that could potentially be illegal, and certainly at a federal level is illegal. So I felt really strongly about using publicly available imagery to do the research in the first place. And then when it came to the story map and trying to present the data in a way that was both useful for sort of looking at patterns, while also protecting privacy. That's why we decided to use the 5-kilometer square hexagons to summarize our data. Of course, it's also kind of nice to have it summarized at that scale because you get a better sense of sort of regional patterns rather than sort of being bogged down in all of the small little clusterings and details. So I think there's sort of a dual function to that. But certainly, like, deciding what that scale was a difficult process, and one that was less scientific than I think I would like, because it's really, at the end of the day, it's sort of a gut call of like what feels too close to share and what is too large to be useful. So certainly there's a lot of trade-offs in that decision. Yeah, did you want to add anything on that, Chris?
Other than, I think you summarized it brilliantly. It also back to some of those hotspot analyses that Ben, I'm sure you're very familiar with as well. That was a great way to maintain landowners' privacies, but also to start seeing what these broader scale patterns were, and seeing what was actually going on, in the county and at the watershed level. But yeah, it was interesting to find that this kind of clustering was occurring pretty much at every spatial level of the analysis. So definitely what we saw seems to be something that would translate well from the broad scale we looked at it, but also all the way down to a much smaller scale if we did choose to try to understand what was going on there.
Yeah, that's a good point as well to emphasize. We have another question that says, what do you think the breakdown in resources was between 1, generating data, 2, doing analyses, 3, creating the story map? This is an amazing project. How feasible is it to make maps like this? So I would say that the feasibility of this map is not much beyond what the feasibility is to do the publication in the first place. I'm not going to lie, it takes work. And it also takes being in a space that values outreach as a component of the research that you do. So I recognize that not everybody is actually in a place that people are going to value your time for working on efforts like these. So generating the data, actually doing the mapping, was probably the most time sink in terms of actual hours spent. As I think you saw, we had something like 10 students. And then I think on my own, I have spent more months of my life mapping cannabis than I really anticipated going into this project. So I would say that is sort of one of the largest time sinks. There are a lot of people who are trying to work on automatic classification for cannabis using satellite imagery, but it's a very difficult process, in part because cannabis can be grown in so many different ways. There's not always enough similar features about them that a computer is really going to be learning that very easily or consistently. So there may be a future in which we don't have to do this by hand, but I don't think we're anywhere near it yet. And then doing the analyses, Chris did a lot of them. He's a GIS powerhouse, and I've been working on some more for the next sort of phase of analyses with some of this data. I would say it's relatively comparable to other spatial data projects. Yeah, Chris, do you have a sense on that?
Yeah, in terms of the doing analysis or the story map portion?
The analysis portion.
Yeah, I think, for this project, what was interesting wasn't necessarily the complexity, perhaps, of the spatial analysis. It was about finding the right kind of spatial analysis to answer the questions that we wanted to answer. And it definitely took some time to trial and error and play with, push and pull in terms of what made sense. But it's absolutely something that I think if you have something in mind for doing broad scale analyses on hotspots, it's if you got an Esri license, or perhaps you just know how to do your coding quite well, you can absolutely jump in and knock something out reasonably quickly. Yeah.
Yeah. I will say, so creating the story map, it's an Esri product. And that means it does help if you have some familiarity with ArcMap or ArcGIS online. It took us, I think, working in earnest, a few months to put together the story map, whereas I think the other portions were a few years. So certainly, like, I would say the least amount of time in the process was the story map creation step. Yeah, do you want to add on that?
All I'd say is, if you have access to Esri products and you've got some spatial data that you'd like to display, creating a story map is a fun and pretty easy way to get that information out there. Phoebe did do a lot of the visualizations, and it's great to be able to see all that work in fruition and be able to share a link. So yeah, definitely a fun part.
Yeah. And I will also say that there are similar products available for like our software. If that means anything to you, if that's part of your world, there are like leaflet maps that you can embed in sort of HTML markdown outputs. I know I'm probably speaking gibberish to some of you, that's fine. So like this is all to say that there are other routes to creating similar products, even if it's not through this particular story map interface. We have a question. Maps are abstractions of the real world. As a researcher from the area, do you think your maps were informed by your experience living in the area? I think that's a really important point. Maps are abstractions of the real world. This gets back to sort of Van's earlier question about what scale and how to represent the data. I'm very aware that maps are just one interpretation of what we're seeing on landscape. They are not objective truth, and they are still subject to our own interpretations. And as you say, abstractions from the real world. So yes, I think a lot of my experiences living in the area, that's particularly why, for instance, I chose some of the variables that I did. So looking at things like zoning, I wouldn't really have thought to do, except that I had been there and been hearing all the discussions around sort of the debates around zoning. Chris, I know you haven't lived specifically in Josephine County, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And it really gets to, as an abstraction of the real world, it really becomes what are the questions that we're trying to answer here. So having lived in Oregon for a little while, and having worked with this project, I think, it's no secret everybody's very interested in what's going on. Right now is a huge shift in how cannabis is being considered and talked about, and there's a lot of changes, and with that there's a lot of questions, and from my experience, it seems as though there are a lot of questions and thoughts and ideas of what's going on, but it's still so new that definitely more research needs to be done to actually put some answers to these questions, and collect that data, and really confirm whether or not what we're hearing from growers, from community, from the government as well, how do they actually stack up, and do they actually make sense? So I think, like Phoebe said in the presentation, this really is a start of a conversation. These are kind of first eyes analyses, and I think we both definitely have more questions of our own that we'd like to answer after seeing some of these results. So yeah.
So we've got question for me. It says, do you have any positions to fill? I'm highly interested in working with you. Reach out, send me an email. I am in the process of finishing my dissertation and transferring into a postdoc. Also working on a component that I started with my dissertation. I don't necessarily have any plans right now to do like a community science component of this research, but I am very interested in collaboration, so reach out and we'll chat. Nancy Byford says, as a neighbor of some of the illegal grows, and a co-conspirator of Christopher Hall, how do you suggest we go about trying to eradicate and negate the attraction to the Illinois Valley in Josephine County? We do have many freshwater streams, and our river is too readily accessible for water theft, which I believe is the major draw to this area, along with the lack of law enforcement. Do you have any suggestions as to what we could do to discourage this, and what do you hope to accomplish? So these are some of the deep questions that I think about a lot, and obviously are a large part of some of my influence for why I wanted to do research in the first place, was sort of address some of these push and pull and tensions around conservation and cannabis production, especially in the Illinois Valley and Josephine County. I think it is very easy for the gut reaction to be, I don't like this, I don't want it here, I don't like what it's doing to my landscapes and my community, and so I want to make it illegal and I want it to go away. I get that as a gut reaction. I think what we struggle with is the history of law enforcement with cannabis regulation, with cannabis production, and that it has not been overwhelmingly successful at actually curbing production or enforcing, positive production practices. And it also has a complicated history of some biases in enforcement methods, and who is targeted in those efforts. So I have those sort of similar concerns about using enforcement as our primary or only tool for enforcing cannabis land use regulations. I do think that we have not yet seen what we could do with similar sorts of resources invested in outreach and education for growing communities around best management practices. This is an industry that really does rely on networks and talking with other farmers about how to grow. And I think that's an untapped resource in terms of trying to change behaviors. One of the other CRC researchers whose work I really admire, Michael Polson, frequently has this thing that he says, which is that you can't regulate something that's illegal. So once people are growing in the illegal realm, regulations can't actually form or influence how they are growing. And I think that doing more to address some of those barriers while simultaneously trying to encourage people to grow better is a really important component alongside any sort of enforcement or addressing of the illegal component. So I don't have perfect answers for it, and I want to see a lot more discussions. I think a really important component is having some of the folks in who are drafting these regulations and enforcement guidelines actually talking with the cannabis production community itself, because there are also a lot of growers who are also frustrated at sort of the quote unquote bad actors in the community and have a lot of thoughts about how to make that balance between sort of enforcement versus education tools. But it's tricky. And that's part of what I'm hoping that we can have conversations around with these maps and saying, okay, 6% of all private land parcels, cannabis is probably not going away anytime soon. So how instead do we shape where and how it's grown? That's my 2 cents from it. But I'm really excited to see what sort of conclusions or thoughts or potential solutions people come up with as well.
Yeah, I think something that's definitely interesting about the area is that there's been legacy grows for a long time now. This is not something that's particularly new on the landscape, as I'm sure Nancy you're familiar with. Hasn't gone away in the past, and it's likely that it's not going to go away in the future. And I really liked your question of, do you have any suggestions for what we could do to discourage sort of illegal growth? And I think Phoebe's earlier discussion point of kind of starts to sort of dive into the same question that you're asking here, which is what is the landscape that we want to see going into the future, right? And really, what do we want to encourage perhaps, and what is it exactly do we want to discourage? And it's important to be able to identify what aspects of each we want to see or not see.
Question here that says, maybe interesting if there was research on areas that are suitable for growing cannabis with the least environmental impact. That would be a parameter or a variety of parameters that would have to be refined. That may be one route of mitigation to provide incentives to grow in these areas instead of punishment and enforcement. Yeah, I agree. I think that's an excellent point. And the tricky part with those sort of assessments of where should cannabis be grown and how is obviously that we have to keep in mind people who have built their livelihoods around cannabis in sort of these legacy areas. And if we decide that that's not where we want cannabis to be mainly produced in the future, we have to be prepared for some of the economic fallout of that for these areas. But I do think, or even within an area, like where do you want it to be grown? How do you, if someone's growing in an area that you don't want it to be, how do you incentivize movement? And there's been some programs that have tried things like in Humboldt, they've had the RRR program, which I'm trying to remember what the R stand for, essentially trying to give incentives for relocation and remediation efforts. So things like that, I think, are understudied in terms of potential options. But any of them require sort of a community conversation around this question of where should cannabis be grown. And it's in part informed by data, but it's also in part informed just by community sentiment and where people see the idealized options. And then we have a follow-up from Nancy, so talking about sort of this history of where cannabis has been grown in this region for a long time. And as this, over the last few years, the conflict has intensified around potentially saying growing illegally and stealing water. And that there's a huge amount of plastic pollution and concerns about water quality. I agree. I think those are some of the big issues. I also will add to that I think one of my big concerns is also like, with enforcement, I would really love the enforcement where they go and they bust the grows and they slash open the water tanks and they pile all the like PVC pipes in place. I would really like to see that paired with, removal of the plastic trash and remediation of the land itself. I would, in an idealized world, like to see that paired with some of those enforcement methods. And I have some similar concerns about the water quality as well. Yeah. And I think it's an open question, right? That we have to ask these communities, especially as background for others who aren't as familiar with Josephine County. This is an area that historically has not really appreciated having lots of law enforcement. And so it's a really delicate conversation to have, is saying, how much law enforcement do you want in your county? What sort of police presence are you willing to have to trade off for the possibility of cracking down on illegal farming, when we also know from histories of enforcement of illegal activity that probably the level that it would take to actually reduce them would be a pretty high ratio probably of law enforcement to people in the area. And so whether or not that's something that people want or is feasible, I think is an important piece of the discussion. And with that, I think we are about at time. So I want to thank everybody for joining us. I think this was a really helpful discussion. I hope you all take a look at the map. Feel free to reach out by email or using the contact form. Thank you to Chris for presenting with me, and thank you to the CRC for hosting the story map and this event.